Hi class, this presentation is going to shift gears a little bit and focus on a few of the projects that you have coming up at the end of this month and also early December. This is going to be a large transition from what you're used to in this class as we start to shift gears from writing a lot of papers concerning the readings to writing pointed papers on topics of relevance to you. In particular, there is the reflection paper or reflexivity paper coming up soon, and that is going to go over basically your own perception of your positionality essentially, and some issues that may affect you either on a daily basis or maybe something on your mind, for instance, COVID as an example, or climate change. And then you will take, hopefully, that foundation from your reflection paper to formulate an intervention proposal. You of course don't need to physically go out and do anything, but it's a proposal. You're going to pitch to me an idea for an intervention, so something that can impact a community as an example, and promote applied positive change concerning an issue of relevance to you. Again, that could be climate change, it could be COVID related. I would love for them to build on to each other, and that sort of is how I have it structured, but they don't necessarily have to be. If there's something that you think doesn't directly impact you when you're in your reflection paper, you may think it's really interesting or really important to address in terms of an applied intervention. But just know that you have some flexibility with these assignments, and really they're just trying to get you to start to think about moving on from being critical, let's say, of issues to the realm of, okay, here's the problem, we recognize that, what can we do to alleviate or prevent it, essentially. Hello class, I hope you are well. This week is going to be engaging with applied interventions, which is going to essentially be building off of everything we've learned this semester so far, as well as your own interests to craft a proposal that will be used to sort of guide your thought process for how you would like to conduct an intervention on a topic of concern or of interest to you. So this is an anthropology class, so I would like you to explicitly engage with participant observation, which is why I assigned you this DeWalt and DeWalt chapter for both chapter 7 today and chapter 11 for Wednesday's class. So I'm going to read you a quote, and I want you to really think about what it's trying to say here in terms of why it's important to put a lot of thought into doing an intervention before you actually do the intervention. So, as they say, paying explicit attention to the design of research enhances the likelihood that the test is as fair as we can make it. It also allows for others to be able to evaluate the degree in which our particular understanding of the world has been influenced by our theoretical position, the particular methods we use to approach the question, and the particular vantage point from which we observe. If you think about what this is saying, you can tease out different things we've talked about throughout the semester here. First, in terms of research validity, so how well can we say this reflects reality? Well, it depends also on from your perspective. If you're a constructivist, reality is what we make it. It's all a construct. If you're taking a more positivist perspective, there is a reality. In a sense, if I drop this apple, gravity will always bring it to the earth. This has been translated to human research to say humans are expected to act a certain way. So if we do this certain thing, so let's say an intervention, we can expect them to do this behavior. A constructivist might argue you can't expect humans to do anything because we're just irrational creatures by nature, including the researchers themselves. So we can perhaps find ways to change their perceptions, and those perceptions may be a way for us to change behavior, which is also how public health tends to do this sort of intervention topic. But we must also be cognizant of our own bias when we're doing this sort of work. What perspective are we bringing in to the research, and how is that going to influence what we find and how we talk about these findings, which is very important in an applied context where we're actually trying to do something. because they're just going to have long-term implications. You're not just writing a paper. This project, if it was in the real world, would have an impact on the community in which you were trying to do research on and with. So keeping that in mind, we need to look at the vantage point of ourselves when we're doing research. So I want you to reflect, which is also why I'm having you do a reflection paper on a topic of interest to you in this semester. Because I want you to reflect on your own personal biases, your own personal stake in at least one or two problems that you see in the US society, ranging from, for instance, let's say the COVID response, or food insecurity, or climate change, whatever is of interest to you. This intervention along the same lines is trying to find something that you would like to change, something that you would like to help do in terms of human behavior. This could be a wide range of topics, so I don't want to lead you too much. So if you have any questions or if you want to pitch me any ideas, that would be a great opportunity for you to explore the potential for you to write a proposal for an intervention. So this is a proposal, not so much you're not doing anything. Of course, you couldn't, given, for instance, a variety of different contexts right now, including COVID, but this proposal is, in a sense, going to help you conceptualize a project that you would like to do or that you think is feasible to be able to do on a topic that you think is important. So throughout these modules, I will try to instill upon you, A, why this is important, and two, how you as a researcher could have a great influence and impact on a community that you think needs help, as an example. So last week I talked about the basic distinction or dichotomy between research for the sake of research. So let's say I go to Belize and I'm doing research on the Zika virus. I write a report about it that I publish in an academic journal. That is not applied because I'm not giving the community anything and I'm not trying to change their behavior. I'm basically just observing what I'm seeing. There's that aspect, and then there's applied work. So let's say I'm going back to Belize and I'm trying to change people's behavior about litter practices. So I'm trying to get them to reduce the amount of litter that they are creating on the island. That's applied because I'm trying to change something about the field site. That could be someone's behavior, or it could be something physical in their environment. So it could be something structural. So I want to increase the amount of free trash cans that are on the island. Or it could be something social. I want to change people's perceptions about the negative consequences of littering. So it may, as an example, drive away tourists because they don't like to see the garbage. Or it may be a risk factor for mosquito breeding, so you don't want to litter. There are different ways you can take this, and that sort of model is often called public health education. There are ups and downs of doing either structural interventions or social interventions. So I'm going to leave that kind of up to you in terms of your proposal, but I want you to think about how can I include participant observation? How can I observe behavior of humans to better create a better intervention? This could be to, as an example, increase the capacity for a certain issue. So how do I reduce litter based on the existing structure to make it better? Or it could be, how do I change people's perceptions? It could be a combination of the two. But one thing that we learn when we're doing interventions is that if you try to do too much, even though that probably is a better reflection of reality, it's really hard to tell as a research objective what was effective. If I increase the amount of garbage cans on the island while also trying to change people's perceptions about littering, they both may play into reducing the amount of garbage on the island. However, was it the trash cans or was it the behaviors that was most effective? It could be both also, and it likely is both. But then when you're trying to evaluate how good a research project is, you need to be able to apply metrics to it. So was it the trash cans that majorly affected the amount of litter? Was it the people's perceptions that majorly impacted litter? You can say both, and that probably is a better reflection of reality. But this is why it's important when someone's doing an evaluation of your project
So let's say when I'm assessing your intervention proposal, I'm going to be thinking about, okay, what factors are you trying to change here? What are the variables in this project? And how can that influence the end result, or maybe even bias the end result? So we have this basic distinction between research for the sake of research and applied interventions. I call this a distinction because that's how it's really conceptualized, but really when you're doing an intervention, you're also doing research. Because it's kind of obfuscated by you doing something. This is why a lot of anthropologists have been, I would say, unrightly critical of interventions, saying they're a-theoretical, or you're not using theory. But, as we know in this class, you can't be a-theoretical because your biases and your perspectives are going to shape your research. And those biases and perspectives, written differently, are theories. I expect someone to act a certain way. If I increase the capacity for trash cans, I'm expecting them to use those trash cans and reduce the amount of garbage that are on the island. If I don't have good research to support that, so if I don't find literature that says increased access to waste management services decreases the amount of litter, I'm kind of just shooting in the dark, and I'm biasing it based on maybe even cultural factors of personal responsibility. So in the US, we have this conception that people should be personally responsible. So you shouldn't litter because you're a responsible citizen. However, this may be a construct of US society. If I'm doing an intervention elsewhere, let's say in Belize, I may be missing the mark of what maybe is a primary influencer for littering. I want you to focus on a problem in the US, but I highlight the Belizean example because, again, there is no one US culture, and what may work in Tampa Bay may not work in New York or somewhere else. So I want you to pick a problem for you, ideally in the Tampa Bay community, but it doesn't have to be there. And then I want you to think about, how can I understand the cultural context here while also crafting a respectable and validated intervention that can be assessed by someone else? So we're going to really dig deep into how you make an intervention that meets those criteria while using participant observation.
For the rest of this semester, we are going to be practicing what's called the scaffolding system in academia, and you've probably heard this term before in other classes. Basically, it just means that we're going to be having consecutive assignments that kind of build on top of each other, hopefully towards a more refined and quality final product. So the first step of that for us is going to be research questions. You are going to submit to me at least 2 to 3 research questions that sort of formulate your understanding of a potential intervention that you may want to conduct. To give an example, if you want to address climate change, you could say, how do people perceive climate change in Tampa? The next question could be, do people perceive it as an issue that can be addressed in Tampa? And these questions can sort of formulate, okay, what kind of answers do I expect to hear, and what kind of information do I think I can get out of this? But remember, it's an applied product, so you're not just trying to see, okay, what is out there, what are people talking about, but how can I also take that information and maybe start to find a way to move beyond that and do something for the community. Using climate change as an example, you can say, for instance, based on your understanding of the literature, which you should be doing a literature review for the proposal, okay, there's a big scholarship area that is expanding called resilience scholarship. And I'm seeing that some scholarship out there is saying that if we build community capacity, let's say, for instance, build homes that are more resilient to hurricanes as an example, this may make them more resilient to climate change over time. So getting community partners to sort of buy into that, or let's say building codes to start to change over time to address that, may be a way to sort of alleviate climate change. You're not going to stop it, of course, but you can find ways to lessen the impact, essentially. That's just one example, and I got some really interesting projects last semester. I don't want to bias you, so I'm not going to give you examples, but if you want to pitch one to me, or if I'm seeing your research question or questions don't seem to be kind of cohesive or make sense, I'll be happy to give you more feedback. This is going to count as an attendance assignment. And that being said, however, I'm going to be looking at the work and giving you feedback and letting you resubmit if you're not happy with the current draft of it, essentially. So don't worry about it, and it's a little bit more lower stakes than the other assignments. But on that note, the key issue reflection paper, you will identify at least one issue of interest and relevance to your life and reflect on your own positionality related to that issue. So, for instance, if we're talking about food insecurity and Tampa as an example, do you feel that you've ever been impacted by food insecurity? And if you haven't, or you have, what kind of factors in your life has shaped that context for you? For instance, if you came from a wealthy family, you probably had a lot of privilege concerning food and you never really had to worry about it, as an example. So you're going to be reflecting, and I'll give you more specific instructions soon concerning that. Actually, a whole presentation on it, essentially. It'll help you kind of fill in the blanks, and it sort of is a way for you to start to identify issues that may be of relevance to you that you don't necessarily have to, but you can expand on in your intervention proposal. And that, which is due at the very last assignment at the end of this semester, building on the key issue reflection paper, hopefully, but you don't have to, you will identify an intervention idea that you would like to sort of formulate. I'll give you the structure for that soon, but basically what I'm looking for is, okay, here's the problem. How can we start to sort of address it? You'll draft to me a 2-page paper for this. I was very impressed and happy with what I got last semester from students, so I expect the same from you all, given the quality of work that I've been seeing throughout this semester. But again, if you have any questions, please just let me know. I'm here for that to happen as well. So digging a little deeper into this reflection paper, I'm encouraging you to think how issues can be intersectional. I'm not going to define that term again because I've done so throughout the semester, so I think you get the idea. But also, you don't necessarily have to. Let's say you're really interested in how climate change is or will have a great influence on your daily experiences. That could be interesting in and of itself. However, just know that this is a 3-page paper, so make sure that you have enough to work with. I'm having you also do a review of the literature, as you'll see in the syllabus, so that should be fine, but just know that you really need to engage with your own perceptions about certain topics and how those are informed by your daily experiences and how literature can sort of help maybe conceptualize those in a more academic sense and articulate what you're really thinking about. If you're stumped about what this could look like for you, I'm providing some examples. I would encourage you not to use these exactly or at all necessarily. And if you do, take them maybe in a different direction, because I don't want to lead you too much, because this is supposed to be your own reflections about an issue of relevance to yourself. So have fun with this if you can, given the circumstances that we are currently in. And if you have any questions, please again feel free to reach out to me. I'm a resource for you. That being said, the 2 examples I have here, which again you can really expand if you feel like you have a stake in that issue, are, for example, structural violence and race related to environmental inequalities. So taking that, environmental inequalities are multifaceted. I could be talking about flood risk due to climate change, or I could be talking about someone living in a food desert or a food swamp, having limited access to grocery stores and clean or nutritious foods compared to fast food such as Burger King or Racetrack, as an example. That being said, another example I have here is reproductive and sexual health services and the access to these services, and how these are biocultural but also linked to policy and structural violence, again, through stratified reproduction. This could be abortion access, it could be access to contraceptives for both men and or women, if we're talking about gender, and how that can maybe even be shaped by race. So, for instance, are women that are white
getting increased access to reproductive services compared to black women in the United States, as an example. So think about how these issues may be impacted or will impact or do impact yourself, or maybe even a loved one, because that will also play into your perceptions of these issues and can help you really dig into topics that we haven't really had a chance to articulate to ourselves in a venue outside of this paper, as an example. Most people probably aren't sitting down and thinking about how different problems affect them. This reflection paper is a way for you to start thinking about that and also articulating how you can possibly intervene on a related issue in your proposal. So how could we increase access to abortion services for black women? Or how can we address flood risk for poor communities that are more at risk for flood risk than an affluent community, as an example? So give this some thought. That's also why I'm having you do a research question proposal, because I want to see what direction you think you want to take this. Or if you're lost or have any questions, I can also help guide you in a certain direction that maybe is more of influence or use to you. I mean, I'm not doing much else right now, so if you need any assistance or if you want any guidance, I'm here for you. Just remember that.
So doing anthropology. Based on the feedback from your interview guides that you gave to me for your GEA1, the documentary assignment, which you'll be getting soon, you will interview someone for GEA2 if you have not done so already. And basically what that interview process is going to entail is what you told me, what you were going to do in that documentary assignment at the very end. And for those that did not include that, you have been notified when the grades have been submitted, and please reach out to me so we can get an idea of what you're looking for or what you'd like to do. I'll also leave comments for you, of course, concerning that. But basically, you'll conduct an interview with someone. It can be a family member, it can be a friend, it can be a coworker, either socially distanced, preferably online, honestly, just because of COVID. And you will sort of understand their sort of take on maybe an issue you found of relevance concerning the documentary that you watched. But also, it's good to see some real-world examples so you can sort of understand or conceptualize what you would like to do. So watch this video really fast, and then afterwards we can start to move on with the presentation. But as you know from this semester, participant observation and interviews are really the bread and butter of anthropological work. But quantitative surveys are also great ways to assess how interventions may perform, as an example. So to kind of build on top of that, the reading that you were given in last week's concerning I think 2 weeks ago actually, concerning that education project, they did a pre-survey and a post-survey. And a pre-survey basically is to understand what is the current level of knowledge or understanding of a topic before the intervention or research even begins. That's sort of the baseline that you can see. Then once the research is over, you then conduct a post-survey, usually the same exact questions, but you can see how people's understanding and knowledge changed over time, hopefully towards your targeted goal with your intervention or research, as an example. I mention this because when you're thinking about your intervention proposal, it doesn't necessarily just need to be participant observations and interviews. However, I am requiring that there is at least some element of PO in the project. Otherwise, you can kind of run with it and incorporate maybe theories or methodologies from maybe your own discipline, or have a spattering of methodologies and theories. But just know that more theories and methodologies that you kind of cram into your project, the messier it gets. And it's harder to really say, okay, is this one thing the mechanism that is impacting community members the most, as an example?
So I'm having you focus on PO, and of course that's the focus of DeWalt and DeWalt's chapters, but they also argue that it is important to have multiple methods when you're doing a research project, because what you're seeing in your observations may be only a small aspect of the reality of your fieldwork. Additionally, just doing PO has the possibility of potentially biasing your research because your eyes are the research tool essentially, and you may be missing the larger picture. which is why they have another quote here which says, while projects based completely on PO are carried out, we believe that the most effective research includes a number of methods that can be used to investigate different aspects of the phenomenon and to improve the likelihood of accuracy and objectivity in a project. What they're arguing for is what's called triangulation. And triangulation essentially means we're going to take different perspectives or points of view and try to see if what we're thinking is reality is actually reality. So giving the Bayesian example, based on my own research, I conducted GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, risk factor mapping to see, for instance, where is the greatest concentration of mosquito breeding risk factors. I then asked community members, where do you think the risk factors are for mosquito breeding? After getting the qualitative data, so the perspectives of community members, and the quantitative data of the actual risk factor mapping of me going to each area in the island that you work at and putting a data point on a map, I was able to make a stronger argument that this exactly is a problem on the island according to both islanders and the actual physical environment. So in a sense, it combines a constructivist point of view. So the reality of mosquito breeding is what community members think it is. So where do they think it is a problem? And I also incorporated a positivist perspective of this is the physical reality of the field site. This is where you will find litter and standing water. So when you're making an intervention proposal, it likely, if you're doing qualitative research, is going to involve you doing multiple methods. This does not need to be extensive, but you still need to have a few different methods to be able to strengthen your overall argument. Qualitative data often gets criticized by quantitative analysis, and that it's really hard to say if what you found when you went to Belize is a reflection of reality or if it's just the reality that you saw. The way to support that is through triangulation. So keep that in mind when you're doing a project that is anthropological, because usually we'll incorporate, I would say, 1 to 3 methods. The most often are quantitative questionnaires, PO, and interviews. I've gone over multiple different kinds of interviews in a previous PowerPoint, so you might want to review those slides. So as an example, there's structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, and naturally occurring conversations. These are 3 different ways of speaking to somebody, but how you approach the conversation is going to influence the data you get and the kind of questions you can ask. So it is important to think about these topics in great detail, as well as review the relevant literature to see what people are asking and what kind of data they're getting from it, so you can have an idea of what to expect and write about when you're doing a proposal. So in order to do effective PO, we must also understand our own positionality. If we don't, we risk potentially biasing the data, and that can lead to problematics concerning us when we're writing about what we found, to people's ability to assess our own work when they are trying to see, for instance, how well an intervention went. So DeWalt and DeWalt say the observer is the research tool. The limits to objectivity flow from this fact. Understanding from where any observer is observing is fundamental to understanding the products of research. It also means that successful use of participant observation supposes that the researcher is able to assess the impact of his/her own viewpoints on a collection of data, analysis, and the written product. This is why we have a term in anthropology and other disciplines now, increasingly, called self-reflexivity, which has become central to understanding the impact of gender, sexuality, ethic, group class, theoretical approach, etc. on observation and analysis. So to break down this term, self-reflexivity essentially means understanding and acknowledging our own positionality. So if I'm a white male researcher doing research on a reproductive health topic in Belize, It is important that I tell the audience that and that I'm cognizant of it when I'm doing research, because that is going to have a heavy influence on what I'm able to access and potentially also how I see a problem in the country. So if I'm a feminist researcher doing a topic, let's say abortion access, overwhelmingly in the research, that means I'm taking the position that countries that limit abortion services unduly put stress, both mental and physical, on women who can't receive abortion services. This can lead to maternal complications, leading to increased maternal mortality and morbidity. Thus, we should increase abortion access. That is based on the science. So, for instance, increased abortion access does limit or reduce maternal morbidity or mortality. But also, the other perspective of that is, so for instance, right to life. They have their own perspective on that topic of abortion access. And if I was, let's say, a quote, right to life, quote, researcher, that would influence how I talked about and how I proceeded to do research on the topic of abortion access. So I need to acknowledge that, because that's going to shape, if not bias, how I'm looking about a certain topic. So when you're doing a anthropological research proposal, it's important to also acknowledge your own positionality. If you're a white male researcher doing a topic, let's say, again, like reproductive or sexual health related, that's going to look differently than if you're a woman doing this topic, because men have an easier time accessing men as a research population than they do women, and vice versa. So when you're thinking about your own positionality, this is going to shape your potential to do an intervention on the ground when you're doing observations. Thus, as DeWalt and DeWalt say, and as I'm trying to get you to do, you should reflect on your own positionality and what issues matter to you before you do an intervention proposal. That way you have a good understanding of why you're doing this topic and why it's important. So thus far, I have been uncharacteristically not giving you a lot of definitions. This is probably what you're thinking at this point, at least. But it is important to think about reflexivity because you're going to be doing a reflexive paper. So we're going to operationalize a definition here to help you sort of think about this topic. So reflexivity, adapting off of Kenneth Guest's definition of the term, is a critical self-examination of the role the anthropologist plays in research and an awareness that one's intersectional identity affects one's fieldwork and analysis. Again, if I am a white male researcher that is heterosexual from the United States, I can keep going on and on about my reflexivity. This is going to play an important role in sort of shaping how people perceive me, how I perceive the world, and how both of those concerns shape the research itself. So watch the video I have here. It's very short, and that'll give you a better understanding of what I'm talking about. And also you may want to start thinking about what makes you you. What intersectional identities do you have based on your life experiences and how you interact with others, as an example. So DeWalt and DeWalt provide a basic structure or formula you can use to follow when you're making a proposal for observations. However, since we are focusing on doing an applied intervention, we need to modify this slightly because they are doing research for the sake of research and we are doing applied work in this context. So some of the elements are the same and some are different. I basically boil this down to 7. If you think of more, feel free to add them when you're doing a proposal, but this is what most people are going to be expecting when they're reading a proposal from you. So first, you need to establish a clear literature review on a chosen topic or concern. It doesn't matter if this is a topic you think you are very familiar with or one that you are not familiar with, because if you don't see what other scholars are doing, you potentially risk the danger of doing repetitive research or doing research that is poorly designed and constructed, which can bias your results. And this is very problematic for an intervention because you are trying to change some aspect of humans, whether that's their behavior or something in their physical or social environment. So these interventions, if not done with the understanding of the literature, can be highly unethical and actually do more harm than good. So once you establish the literature review, the next step is to establish your research questions. So what is the literature saying? What are anthropologists, for instance, asking? And how are they framing these questions in terms of doing research? So if I'm trying to conduct research in Belize on the Zika virus, my research questions are going to frame basically the entire project. They're very important because they're going to frame the sort of questions I ask and what I'm looking for when I'm in the field. That leads to saying explicitly what you would like to do. So this is your methodology. So you would like to conduct interviews and provide questionnaires to better understand Zika virus in Belize. This is important because Zika virus is a concern for instance, pregnant women, as it can cause maternal complications. This is the importance of it, the justification for why you need to do this methodology. Now, this methodology can be used to better answer your research questions over other methods, for instance. So you have the methods, you have the literature review, and you have the questions. However, you need to then establish your field site. If I'm going to Belize, I can't just say I'm looking at litter in Belize because that's a very big country. I need to be more specific because a proposal reviewer is going to be looking at those specifics to see if the project is manageable and doable given your given time frame. So if I'm doing research for, let's say, 3 months, I could probably touch on a few different field sites, but an anthropologist reading the proposal would say you're not spending enough time there to really understand the cultural context and get that thick description we need to say, for instance, that this is definitely what's happening here. So it's good to be very specific. I'm not conducting litter research in Belize, I'm conducting it in Key-Cocker, Belize. I've picked a field site, one location. After you have your field site, your methodology, your questions, and your literature review, then you need to pick what's called your target population and activities. So if I'm talking about Zika virus, I want to talk to doctors, nurses, public health specialists, vector control workers, community members, and tourists, because I perceive those to be having a high influence in the spread of Zika, and I want to understand what their perceptions are of Zika virus, because I think that may play a role in mosquito breeding risk factor management, as well as the spread of mosquito-borne diseases in general. So that is sort of the places and the individuals. The activities could be, if you're doing observations, for instance, where are you doing these observations? Are you going to community centers? Are you doing ride-alongs in someone's vector control vehicle? Are you participating in activities on a beach? These are things that you need to conceptualize, because if you're just doing observations, this could mean many different things for many different people. If I say I'm going to Belize to do research on the Zika virus in Key-Cocker, if someone Googles Key-Cocker, they'll see it's a tourist island, so they might assume I'm just going to hang out in a bar all day. It's important to say what you're doing explicitly, because again, the proposal reviewer is trying to see, does this make sense? Is this superfluous? So is there a point in you doing this? This is important because you need to maximize the effectiveness of your intervention. So am I wasting my money doing this, or the researchers' funders' money doing this intervention? And also, this is a good way to triangulate the data, because if I'm talking to doctors, vector control workers, and community members, this is going to give me a better understanding of the reality of Zika virus in Key-Cocker, more than if I just talk to doctors or community members. So what you plan to do is going to shape your intervention, and also the data you collect, which is going to give you either really good research that you can publish, for instance, or it may be very biased research that you shouldn't publish because it was done sloppily. All this is very important, and a proposal reviewer is going to be thinking about all of these different topics when they're looking at your proposal. In this case, it's going to be me. Now, another part which I'm going to put less emphasis on, because again, this is an intervention proposal for this class, is how much money you would need. So you need to start thinking about how you would budget for certain things. Thankfully, anthropology research usually is pretty cost effective, which is another buzzword to throw out there when you're doing a proposal, because we don't really need a lot of things. If you're doing an observation, you're kind of just hanging out with people. So it's hard to justify putting a dollar sign on that. You could, for instance, what often is done is you say, I need to pay for room and board, food, the airplane ticket, taxis possibly, etc. That's really about it. Now, if you are doing other methodologies, let's say you're doing a questionnaire, you may need to print out the questionnaire. Or if you're doing it on a tablet, you may need to budget in the tablet you're going to be used when you're doing the questionnaire with people. So think about all these different expenses and then formulate a basic, it could be a ballpark number. You can even do pie in the sky if you want to do a very in-depth intervention. Just know that the proposal reviewer is also going to be thinking about, okay, does the money here make sense? Are they asking too much? Are they not asking for enough to justify what they want to do? It's an important aspect of this. And then finally, a topic which I haven't gone into too much detail here is how to do analysis. I mentioned coding, I think a few classes ago, as well as an example I provided of how you can quantify your answers from participants. So again, a very simple one is tabulation. So if 8 out of 10 people have a certain perception on a topic, that's 80% of your participants having a certain idea of how reality is based on that question. Again, that's a very small sample size, so you may again need to think about how many people you want to talk about and talk with also too when you're doing a research proposal. That's a lot of information, but hopefully these bullets can help you sort of think about what you would like to do and start formulating in your mind how you think a feasible research project can be done following this formula in a given time period, but again is up to you. I'm leaving this pretty open. Just make sure that you're covering all the necessary elements. So near the end of chapter 7, DeWalt and DeWalt provide basically the questions that reviewers ask themselves when they're looking at a proposal. When I'm assessing your proposal, I'm going to be asking myself these questions as well. So going through this, I have itemized it through 1 through 7. However, 6 and 7 are what I'm contributing to this in order to better fit it to what we're trying to do. So they say the questions are important to answer. So this is very basic. Is there a point in doing this research? This is of course subjective, but that is essentially the whole process of doing a proposal, is you are getting evaluated based on other people's perceptions of your own research. So you need to spin this and say why this is very important to do. Some keywords to consider when you're thinking about this are there is a timely nature to this research. So if you're doing, let's say, a COVID-19 research, you can say because of this rapidly changing context, it is important to know what is happening on the ground. Therefore, I'm proposing answering these research questions to have a better understanding and to better prepare for interventions concerning COVID-19 responses. That's one way of framing it. One easily conceptualized one is also climate change. It's easy to pitch to proposal reviewers that climate change is a growing crisis. Therefore, we need to get on the ground and do this research now. 2, they say answering these questions will add to existing knowledge. This is where the literature review comes into place. If the reviewers don't think you did a sufficient literature review, they're going to think that you may be answering questions that are already answered, or that you didn't put enough time into conceptualizing why this project is important to you, and also the community in which you wish to do an intervention in. This leads to the research site. So does it make sense that you're going to Key-Cocker to look at Zika virus? You need to justify this by saying, in my example, the Ministry of Health declared the island to be endemic for Zika virus transmission. Think about how this is going to be in your own proposal. So why should I go to Feeding Tampa Bay to do research on food insecurity? Or why should I go to a elementary school or kindergarten to assess traffic conditions outside of the school system? Then we get to the theory about what you're doing. So if you're utilizing theory explicitly, because they're going to think you're using theory no matter what, whether that's without you thinking about it unconsciously or more engaged with explicitly, they're looking for theory. So a big red flag for a reviewer is there's no mention of theory. So this is very important. So this is where the concepts in this class come into play. So think structural violence, think symbolic violence, think biopower. These are all theoretical concepts in the sense that researchers utilize them or operationalize them when they're doing research to either understand what's going on or to do an intervention to better inform what they're trying to do, essentially. So then this leads to the doing, which is the methodology. Do the methods of your research make sense in your proposal? If you're looking at Zika virus in Belize, and you say you would like to analyze media reports about how the Ministry of Health is communicating to the public, you need to justify why that media analysis is important. In my case, I thought it was important because this is what community members are most likely going to be getting as an information source, not the CDC or the WHO, for instance. Now, the two aspects of this that I want you to also engage with, because they correspond to your own reflexivity, is your own positionality. So does the proposer, you, the researcher, engage with their own positionality in their proposal and how that can influence what they expect to find? If you're a white male engaging with a reproductive topic again, you should acknowledge that, because that's going to influence your own perspective on the topic, as well as how people will correspond with and talk to you about that topic. So this is why anthropologists often argue that people need to be more explicit within their own positionality, which is self-reflexivity. Now, tied to positionality is ethics. So does the research make sense ethically? Are you doing something that does not adhere to the anthropological code of ethics, which I've engaged with in a previous week? The link below is, again, linking to those code of ethics. So that's going to be what I'm also going to be thinking about when I'm looking at your proposal. So is your project ethically grounded and you're not doing something unethical? I'm not going to list examples because that would defeat the purpose, and I'm not trying to make you think about doing unethical research. But just know that I'm also thinking about ethics when I'm evaluating the proposal. And so will reviewers. Whether or not that's an explicit bullet on their questionnaire is a different story. But that's going to be on everyone's minds as humans. Does this make sense? Is it ethical? Does the amount of money they're asking feel appropriate in the given context? All these questions are going to be in my mind when I'm reviewing your proposal.